All right. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. Before we get started on the panel of active cyber defense, whether or not to hack back, there are a few announcements I wanted to make that will be familiar to many of you. One is questions from the audience. We will leave time for questions. I know it's a great group here, and so we're very interested in your questions and in having a dialogue. I'm going to try to stop our discussion around 11 to make time for questions from the audience. The method will be to submit the questions via question cards. So no need to wait, just fill them out whenever you have a question. Don't wait until the end to submit them. Pass them to the aisle and then have the person on the aisle. So if you're in an aisle seat, it's like being in the exit row. You have responsibilities, which is to raise your hand so the cards can be collected by the summit staff in the rooms collecting them, and then they'll bring them up to the front. This session is eligible for continuing education credits. If you are interested in obtaining them, please be sure to have your badge scanned at the end of the session by the summit staff in the back of the room, and an email will be sent out to those scanned after the summit is over. And this is open to the media in these breakout sessions. After the session, please join us at the exhibit hall outside of the Potomac Ballroom for a networking and exhibits break. And with that, let me switch to our panel for today. I'll give a brief introduction of the panelists. We're fortunate to have with us today the General Counsel of the National Security Agency, Glenn Gerstell, and Adam Hickey, who is the Deputy Assistant Attorney General, who is the lead lawyer when it comes to national security cyber threats. He's at the National Security Division in the Department of Justice. We also have Wyatt Hoffman, who is a senior research analyst at the Cyber Policy Institute for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And we have Rich Boscovich, Assistant General Counsel at Microsoft, who, as a part of the Digital Crimes Unit, was really involved with some of the first and pioneering takedowns using civil authorities of botnets. So please join me in a round of applause for our panelists today. And with that, I'm going to kick it off with a brief introduction. So what we're talking about today is active cyber defense. And one thing I noted when I switched from government as being the Assistant Attorney General in charge of national security to the private side of the House representing companies who are victims is the frustration among many private sector victims that they are now being told, and we're going to go a little bit into the threats today, repeatedly, that what they are facing is not just routine criminal activity, but it's often blended, that the criminals are linked to nation states and that nation states are increasingly conducting criminal activity to the point at which North Korea is using it as a way to raise currency and to evade sanctions. So on the one hand, they're being told that they're in the midst of these national security threats, but on the other hand, they are neither permitted, because of the national security implications, to take steps on their own to disrupt attacks that are occurring or to take acts to collect information outside of their networks. And at the same time, they're not finding that the government, when they reach out for help, is often taking steps, again, to disrupt, or that they're getting additional actionable intelligence on the front end of the threat so that they can take precautionary steps to protect themselves. And so our panel today is really with a distinguished group from inside and outside government, is to talk about what are those gray areas, what are the gaps, and are there additional steps that companies could be taking or working with the government to take that they're not currently taking because there is insufficient clarity. And with that, let me start with Glenn to describe a little bit about what we're seeing from the National Security Agency's perspective on current threats.
Okay, thanks, John, and thanks to INSA and all of you for being here this morning. Looking forward to our discussions on this really critical topic. So, John, you've outlined the problem. We could spend hours on just describing the problem. I think we're all familiar with it. Let me boil it down to two simple points. One, excuse me, we're in the midst, I think we all know, of a global cyber pandemic. I think it's probably fair to say that it's going to get worse before it gets better. There are some estimates that I think you've seen about the scope of losses attributable to cyber mischief. One estimate that I saw a couple days ago said that over the next 4 to 5 years, there's an estimated $8 trillion of loss. And just to put that number in perspective, what does that such a large number mean? That's the entire economic output of South Korea over that period. So just sort of give you a sense of the scope of the magnitude of this. And the reasons for this, we all know. The dynamic is going in the wrong direction. Namely, the opportunities for cyber mischief are increasing at a great rate. We can explore that for a second. And on the other hand, the opportunities for our ability to defend against it are not increasing at the same rate. So on the opportunity side, we all know the greater complexities associated with the Internet of Things coming, 5G, the massive amounts of data that will be stored associated with artificial intelligence, all sorts of new apps. All of this you put together, we could spend hours on it, but if you put it all together, it's increasing the opportunity, or the attack surface, as the military folks like to call it, for mischief. And that's increasing at an extraordinary, breathtaking rate. We all are aware that there's going to be something like 20 billion Internet of Things devices connected to the Internet in the next year or two, if there aren't already. No one's quite sure of the number. And again, to put that number in perspective, that means when you wake up tomorrow morning, there's going to be 5 million more devices connected to the Internet than this morning, and the same the next morning and the next morning. So it's a massive amount. We all know that the barriers to entry in this area for doing cyber mischief are low. It's possible to obtain tools online to create ransomware and other attacks quite easily. So, as I said, that dynamic is going the wrong way, which is the opportunities increasing, and the ability to do mischief is increasing at a great rate. There are 4 countries in particular, turning to the second point, 4 countries in particular that we worry about. I'll just touch on them briefly, and then we can go back to more details, John. But I think we all know that every year the directors of the various intelligence agencies go before Congress in January to describe the annual threat picture. For the last, I think, 6 or 7 years, maybe 8 years, the number one threat identified to the national security of this country is the cyber threat. And that hasn't changed, and I said is getting worse. There are four countries in particular that we focus on. Russia, with its great potential for mischief, particularly in the misinformation and disinformation area. Fascinating to think that a country, relatively small, this just shows you the effect of cyber, relatively small country in terms of its economic throw weight, right? This is a country that has the GDP of less than the states of Illinois and Pennsylvania. And yet, look at the mischief it's able to create in the cyber world. So Russia's clearly one. 2 is China, with its particular focus. Each country is a little differently focused, with its focus on the theft of intellectual property and stealing information, everything from the OPM breach of a few years ago to ongoing incidents aimed at the defense industrial base and all aspects of our economy. North Korea, as John mentioned, is particularly focused on financial crimes, going after cryptocurrency weaknesses, et cetera. And then finally, Iran, a very unpredictable operator, particularly focused on creating mischief in the Middle East, but also has been focused on doing damage here in the United States in terms of attacks on infrastructure and banking systems and elsewhere. So those are 4 nation states that we need to worry about. And as John said, one of the issues that we're going to be talking about is exactly dealing with this asymmetry of helping the private sector on one hand, and yet dealing with nation states who are conducting activities below the act of war, so we're not engaged in a military response, and we need to figure out what exactly is the right approach to that.
Let me turn a little bit to Adam to see. So we've heard from Glenn that we're in the midst of a pandemic that's getting worse. Do you agree with the assessment of the threat?
Yes.
All right.
That's reassuring. That's good. So there is alignment in the government.
I think on the topic of the panel, I think it'd be good to level set a bit of what we're talking about when we say active cyber defense or hackback. The way these panels come to be typically is that there is a popular imagination or imagining of the beleaguered IT professional at a company who sees the data on a large plasma screen slipping out of the company's network, and it's just out of his reach, and if only he could go delete it from the server to which it was transferred, he would save the company. And let me suggest that that as a model for this discussion is inaccurate and not what we should spend our time talking. And there are a couple reasons for that. One is that most of the studies I've seen suggest that the average time it takes to discover a data breach is about 6 months, certainly months. The odds that the hackers will have transferred it only once to an identified IP address and left it there without copying it or removing it from the United States in that time strikes me as very, very unlikely. Second, even if you see the data leaving your network, it's less clear to me that you will have the credentials required to actually access that system, even if you could legally, that would enable you to delete that copy of the data if it were the only copy of the data. And when we talk, when this scenario is invoked, there's often a suggestion that if you were robbed physically, you could go and get back your television or the like, but in fact, the law doesn't let you do that either in most cases. So the physical world doesn't provide a helpful framework for justifying that kind of conduct. So when we at the department have asked quietly, what is it you would want to do that you can't do, that you feel like the law prohibits, and we have sort of Chatham House rules type conversations with security companies, we don't hear a lot back. We have not yet identified the technique that people want to engage in that doesn't involve more risk management than purely a legal analysis of what is lawful or not. But nonetheless, what we've been saying since 2015 is if you have a circumstance where you think your data has been stolen and you know where it is, but you feel the law constrains you from getting it, you should immediately call the FBI. We do have authority to search and to seize data and to make it inaccessible, and you should take advantage of that. We have never gotten a call with that request that I'm aware of. I think because 6 months after the breach, you probably don't think that the data only is where you identified it landing on. But the offer still stands that you should let us know if you have that circumstance, and we'll move swiftly, just like we move swiftly to capture evidence all the time. I do have a theory that some of the support for this conversation comes from not endpoint victims, not the IT workers I'm describing, but those who would seek to monetize surveillance. And what I mean by that is engage in their own intelligence collection, including through unauthorized access to computers, which they would then sell to the private sector. And if that's the case, then we should talk openly about whether that kind of surveillance should be legal by the private sector and whether it's okay to monetize it. But that's not the conversation we usually end up having.
Well, being the moderator, we can have that conversation today. So let's talk a little bit and maybe hear from you. What do you think about the idea? So we've heard from Glenn that we're in a global pandemic that's getting worse, that's costing trillions of dollars. And there's clearly a gap then in the government's ability to obtain intelligence in a usable way by the private sector. I think Adam's described moving into that gap have been companies who collect either by technical means or sometimes by human means information that they use to provide to the private sector. Is there sufficient clarity in the law? Is it a good thing for companies to be moving into that space?
Let me start by noting that I come from kind of a different perspective here, not only not being a lawyer, but also coming from a think tank focused on international security and systemic risks. We look at this first and foremost as a global governance problem because this stuff is already going on. There's signs that it's going on in an international sort of emerging market for what you might call active defense services. If you can't do it in the United States, it's very easy to get a firm in a more permissive jurisdiction to do it for you. And
pause as you do. What for you? What are you seeing that? Where are the gaps? What do people want?
So I should say much of the evidence is anecdotal. But there is evidence that, for instance, in the financial sector in different parts of the world, there are banks that will hire firms to do kind of server takedown services, where if they're suffering from a DDoS attack or a persistent threat, they'll hire a firm in a jurisdiction where it's a little more permissive than the United States to do it for them. There's a whole spectrum of activities that we're talking about. And so, Adam talked about kind of the hackback scenario that often gets thrown out, hacking back to retrieve your data. But there's a whole spectrum of techniques that, whether or not we want to call them active defense, these techniques exist. And they range from things like beaconing, where data gets exfiltrated from your network and it sort of pings back to you and gives you information to help locate it, to more and more aggressive things like honeypots that could actually cause some sort of disruption to an attacker, all the way up to and including hacking back, and even within hacking back, we could quibble about how to define it. But the point is, I think there's already sort of a supply and a demand for active cyber defense. And so this is, first and foremost, in our view, a global governance problem. We need rules of the road internationally. And whatever we decide to do with the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, whatever we decide to do with the United States law, we have to reconcile with that international picture, where this is not entirely in our control, or in the government's control, I should say. The second sort of difference in perspective I take is that I view this first and foremost as a question of self-help. So we can often get lost in these sort of esoteric, technical and legal details of these activities, but I think at its core the debate here is who's responsible for securing the private sector, given this threat environment that Adam described. If the government's responsible, what does that entail? There are trade-offs. There's a risk of a moral hazard there. And we can talk about those options. But if the government's not responsible fundamentally for securing the private sector, then what sort of discretion do we allow to corporations commensurate with the responsibility that we place on them to secure this environment? And so I think that's how I would frame this whole question about how far should we let corporations go. And we can get into the legal and policy questions around the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and some of the specifics. But I think, as you pointed out, John, there is a capacity problem. The United States government simply cannot be in every private sector network, nor would we necessarily want them to be, defending against foreign threats. There's a growing space of sophisticated cybercrime enterprises that operate like sleek Silicon Valley startups that offer ransomware as a service and that sort of thing. And so there is a rationale, a strategic and policy rationale for trying to harness the tremendous capacity that's located in the private sector. And I think that there are policy options and ways that you can do that are not equivalent to opening the floodgates and sort of unleashing the Wild West in cyberspace.
Can I just add a point that I think we all know, which is that all these discussions about self-help, hacking back, et cetera, taking action into your own hands, and why can't the private sector do something about this, are premised on the understanding that we'll be able to not only discover the threat, which is Adam pointed out as something that companies often don't recognize they've been penetrated, whatever, so there's a time lag. But more importantly, to me, is the question of attribution. With today's sophisticated cyber actors, they are very, very adept at covering their tracks. So the notion that a private sector, or indeed even a government, is going to be able to figure out in any meaningful time exactly who caused an attack, let alone questioning your ability to do something about it, is a real open question. And I think we need to bear that in mind, because it's not just a question of, oh, I see the data slipping out, I know exactly who stole it. It may look like X is stealing it, but in fact it's Y, or it may not even be Y, it may be 3 layers beyond that.
It's a good point, and let's push on it, though, a little bit. And Rich, I think you're in a good position to do it, because Microsoft in some ways pioneered lawfare in this space by deciding that they could detect malevolent activity that was taking place, particularly with the construction of botnets, and then using, at the time, a novel legal theory to take action and disrupt on its own.
It's interesting, because I take a very different approach, a much more hands-on approach as a technician, a legal technician, in looking at the problem. When we first started looking at the problem years ago, it was a combination of not necessarily looking for attribution. I think that a private sector multinational like Microsoft, that's not our responsibility. That's really a government responsibility, and that's why we work very closely with the government in providing information, which we collect during our operations for the attribution piece. We're focused on detecting the harm and trying to literally look at the business model of the criminal and disrupt that business model, because it's a business. I think we were talking about loss figures here, the trillions of dollars. That's how they make their money. So we took a step back and said, well, how do they make their money, and how do you disrupt their infrastructure within a legal framework? So when we started doing our work, the idea was to identify the specific types of malware and map it back through a process which was within, a privacy issue, open, and would not necessarily run afoul of any privacy concerns. You're looking at basically just code, map out their command and control structure, and then develop a legal framework in the United States on the civil side to be able to disable their ability to actually attack and do more harm. So you look at what we've done over the past 11 years. Initially, most of the infrastructure that we identified was located in the United States. The criminals wanted a good infrastructure that was up and running all the time, and the U.S. has very good infrastructure. And we were fortunate that when we started our program, we were able to either seize domains through multiple common law causes of action in federal court, as well as identify servers, which at the time were dedicated servers, and that's important because they weren't compromised, and able to take down servers pursuant to the use of novel applications of the Lanham Act. And with that, be able to basically stop the harm against our customers, and then develop enough evidence to give to law enforcement so that they could do their job in terms of attribution. What we've seen more recently, and I think you're seeing a greater level of sophistication on the criminal side, is that their infrastructure is not necessarily in the United States anymore. Pieces of it are, most of it is international. And so we've changed the way we've operated in terms of doing much closer private-public cooperation, working closely with U.S. law enforcement, European law enforcement, and so forth, to be able to identify the infrastructure, take what we can domestically through legal process, and then push out the rest to law enforcement so they could do their best in terms of doing their, get their paper, get their T3 equivalents, both domestically or overseas, to be able to do the attribution piece. What we're seeing recently, and I think this goes to some of the points that were raised by the panel, is that we're really worried about things like IPv6. It's fantastic when your refrigerator has its own IP address and your scale has its own IP address, but the attack surface is going to exponentially increase, and we're seeing it already. We've been working on a couple of projects where the number of IoT devices, which are now being leveraged by cyber criminals as part of that infrastructure, has grown tremendously. Routers across the world. Most people don't change the passwords on their routers. You should change the password on your routers that are now being used as CNCs. So it's getting much more difficult for even the private sector to be able to go out and do some of these disruptive actions. And what I see in the future is that there's going to be a much higher dependency between both public and private working together on this issue, because the level of sophistication that we've seen, and as a result of IPv6 and other advancements in technology, are going to make our work a lot harder.
Hey, Rich, I wonder if I could ask a follow-up question. First, let me just say I applaud the disruptive approach that you're taking, and if you could multiply it by 10 or 100 and we could help you do that, we'd love to do that. I remember being struck by the first time I think that you invoked the Lanham Act in one of your takedowns, which I thought of. I took one IP class in law school, but I remember it as a trademark-related statute. Have you ever had a pattern where what stopped you from taking action was a provision of the law? In other words, have you come across a fact pattern, identified a technical solution, and then said there is no way, even in partnership with the government, that we can address it? And let's focus domestically first, if we could. And I ask that because I want to see whether the debate here is about the law and 1030 or if we're thinking about something else.
That's a good question. And my response to that is I've never run into that situation. I mean, I think that if you look at 1030, and even when it was back with the government, it's been around for a long time, look at the Lanham Act, it really becomes...
Because we're in a so 1030 is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act provisions that are really designed to criminalize hacking. The idea was we're in a new world. We have computers, actually was written in 1986. New world or new types of crimes that are taking place. But at the same time, because it prohibits hacking unauthorized access into networks, I think what Adam was getting at is there might be concern that it would be a deterrent to hacking back because it's neutral. So if you're a private company and you decide you don't like the bad guys and you commit unauthorized access overseas, you could be prosecuted. In fact, the criminal division of the Justice Department has said there is no free pass for hacking back. And so then the question is, are there some activities that are somewhere between defending your own network and hacking back that a company like Microsoft might want to take where they can't?
Right, and let me be very clear, Microsoft does not condone hacking back. It just doesn't work, and I think that the members here on the panel probably agree with me on this one. If you wear a private sector hat on, you start doing the risk-benefit analysis, doing something like that, you know, the worst thing that could happen is you technically might be able to, and if you push code out and something goes wrong, and it happens to be that hospital in the middle of an operation and someone passes away because of your good intention. So the liability there is enormous. So hacking back is not something that you want to do. But what we have done is use 1030, which is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. I apologize for using the numbers there. Or the Lanham Act, which is the Trademark and Copyright Act, in such a way that will allow us to use those causes of action to seize, in the case of a command and control structure, which is domain-based, domain name-based, which is viewed as property. And we seize that property via utilization of those statutes. And once you have that in your control, now you're able to identify the number of victims because their computers are communicating with that domain, which is now in your possession. Legally, you've taken it over within a legal framework. And then you could work with governments, ISPs, internet service providers, and certs to even inform those individuals that they're infected. Many times, as was mentioned earlier, a company may have an intrusion. It will go maybe 4, 5, 6 months, and they don't know they had that intrusion. We would be able to work and let them know that, hey, you've got a serious problem. Your IP is pinging a sinkhole, which we've identified as being part of a malicious cybercrime network. So the Lanham Act, common law causes of action, trespass to chattels, tortious interference with a contractual relationship, all of these things, Adam, we've used very successfully, and I think the tools are there.
And of course, you know, we've, John, to your point, the community of computer security researchers have long complained that the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, because of its very broad terms, effectively prevents them from undertaking the kind of penetration testing and intrusion testing that they would need in order for benign purposes, to figure out whether a system's vulnerable, and there's a concern as to exactly could you be unintentionally running afoul of the law in doing a perfectly, quote, legitimate activity. So there are some areas of debate in that community about it.
Question for you, Glenn. Adam applauded the disruption that Rich was describing, but without deconfliction, disrupting an identified command and control network could result in the loss of intelligence, I'd imagine, that might make it more difficult for National Security Agency or others to do their mission. Where do you see the line being drawn? Is it always helpful to disrupt? How should private companies work with the government before taking a disruptive action that might result in the loss of intelligence?
Good question. So I think our starting point would be that in our system, we don't have a scheme whereby private sector companies are able to take disruptive action, certainly with respect to either domestic or foreign targets. So as a broad matter, that's not something we would expect the private sector to be engaged in. That is indeed the responsibility partly of law enforcement, the FBI on one hand, and more significantly, the sister to the National Security Agency, sister entity, which is the United States Cyber Command, which is the entity of the United States government that is responsible for so-called offensive actions necessary to protect the country in terms of the cyber domain. So it's the responsibility of the U.S. Cybercom command to undertake that kind of action. And because of the nexus that you just referred to, John, between, on one hand, concerns over loss of access to intelligence, which is vital to our country on one hand, versus taking action that might unintentionally affect that intelligence ability because of an offensive action to deny or degrade or disrupt an adversary's use of their computer network. That's joined under one hat, so to speak, in the form of the commander of the U.S. Cybercom, was also the director of the National Security Agency, and the two agencies work hand in glove just precisely to do the deconfliction that you described. So that is something that is a very significant issue for us. And we saw a great example of it, if I may just add one last comment, a great example of that partnership working in the last election. In the 2018 congressional midterm elections, the Director of National Intelligence and the Secretary of Homeland Security both said that those elections were the safest we've had in recent times, and that's precisely because of the actions taken by the United States government in a concerted way to thwart adversaries who I think would have taken significant action in that election.
That's good. Wyatt, that's a good frame point. So Glenn has said that the 2018 elections were the safest elections in a long time?
Well, perhaps, or at least from a cyber point of view, yes.
From a cyber point of view, even at a time what you've previously described, that when it comes generally to cyber threat, things are bad and getting worse fast. So if you're in the banking industry or retail industry and you hear that the 2018 election model worked when the government did share intelligence and take disruptive action, what you've described earlier is that there are gaps when it comes to the private sector. Who should fill those gaps? Is that something the government can fill with governance changes? Are there others who could fill those gaps?
I guess first off, when I talk about kind of trying to unlock the capacities of the private sector, it's certainly not for hacking back. That's I think we're all in agreement on that point. And I'm really not interested in sort of rehashing debates about kind of that and getting stuck in that false dichotomy that this is either hacking back or nothing. What I'm interested in is there a space that we can identify where we could envision maybe it's just those sort of professional managed security providers that are doing it. Maybe it's just one or two techniques like beaconing. Maybe there are other requirements like third-party liability coverage that have to be part of it in order to even think about it. But can we identify a certain space where we could see a role for the private sector within a sort of broader relationship that you're describing where the government's involved to varying degrees? That's what I'm sort of interested in exploring, and that's what I think if we're interested in, again, in the international context, disincentivizing corporations from resorting to those riskiest activities, we're better off trying to find ways that we can unlock their capabilities to more effectively defend against threats.
And if I could, let me just give an example of how I think that could look. So a couple of months ago, a former colleague of mine, now in the private sector, at what I'll call a security firm, had coffee with me and said, look, I'm getting pushback from my general counsel's office. We want to do work on the dark web to collect exploits and potentially stolen data for our clients, so we either can help mitigate the exploit, right, repair the product that has the vulnerability, or help our clients understand what data has been taken and either comply with their legal obligations or in terms of notification or otherwise dimension the loss. And I said, that's, obviously we can't be everywhere, so, consistent with not having unauthorized access, that sounds like something I hope you and a lot of people are doing. I can see a couple risks. You certainly wouldn't want to do anything that comes close to soliciting or aiding and abetting criminal conduct, right? So how the interaction on the dark web looks, you certainly don't want to be in a position where your company is encouraging someone to develop an exploit that is then used, or you are seen to be commissioning something. So that's one risk I think you'd want to be cognizant of. Second, I'm not sure who you're paying, but you want to look out for the risk of paying a sanctioned or designated entity or their agent, right? I mean, you don't want to be sending money to North Korea or Iran and creating more legal risk for the company. And third, what if the data isn't your client's and belongs to someone else? How are you going to handle, what responsibilities do you have in that circumstance and what do you do with it? All of these seem like risks we could work with, but I wonder if the best solution is for you to work with the FBI, and we can sort of look around the corner a little bit when you're trying to do something and partner with you. And you make the internet a slightly safer place, but you're working with the government, so that helps address some of the legal risk your general counsel might be concerned with. And he said, that sounds great. Would you be willing to talk to our lawyers? And I said, yes, absolutely. We'll have a meeting, bring your general counsel's office in. And so he proceeded to do that. The meeting showed up on my calendar. And then a couple days later, I received a very terse note that this meeting is being postponed pending further internal collaboration or coordination. So while people like to make fun of lawyers, at least in this story, I don't think the government lawyers or the government's laws are the issue. I hope that conversation happens. I hope it is not a cancellation of the meeting. I hope it's a postponement. But I think you got to crawl before you walk and walk before you run. So the sort of partnership I'm describing where a company identifies legal risk and wants to manage it, one of the ways you can do that is not by the government issuing an sort of public diktat that 1030 or another statute means X instead of Y, but rather partnering operationally with the FBI or potentially another agency to accomplish your objectives. I don't know that that will work in all circumstances, but there is precedent for this. There was at one point a pilot program essentially where an FBI agent, I think, was working with companies in his community that saw data on the web and wanted to purchase it because they thought it might have their data, but also didn't want to be in a situation where they were paying criminals or taking responsibility for data that wasn't actually theirs. And so the FBI agent says, look, if I see an investigative interest to it, I'll pursue that, and then if it's your data, you'll know, and if it's not, we'll handle it the way the government should handle it. I like that model. It's creative. Does it scale? Well, if it's effective, it could. It might take some work to get there, but that's the kind of openness to new ideas that I think we, DOJ and FBI, should have. And I think we have it, and so you should call us.
I really like that kind of last point, and I just wanted to throw a few more kind of ideas on the table because I do think there's a spectrum of options short of amending the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and sort of opening this space up. DOJ could issue no action letters. It could issue enforcement priorities and sort of clarify how it exercises prosecutorial discretion when it's enforcing the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. If there's something like a beacon that we can identify, then we can sort of target that and try and bring clarity to the private sector that this is something that, if it's done under these circumstances, and there are a range of sort of guardrails you can put on that to define those circumstances, we're not going to prosecute you under Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. I think that's where there's an interesting area worth exploring because we have this kind of chicken and egg problem where we don't really know what works. We don't know what can be deployed at scale with manageable risks. But ultimately, this issue isn't going away. These things are being done internationally, and we need to kind of strike a balance between the roles in the government and the private sector. And so I think a cautious but sort of flexible experimental approach where we take certain things off the table and find ways that we can actually sort of clarify to the private sector, here are things that you can do, and if you do them in this way, such that you're not causing this kind of undue harm, we're not going to go after you for it. And that essentially isn't that different from how DOJ already treats these cases.
I would just add, I agree with what both my colleagues have said, and I just think this underscores what the future is going to hold for us, which is the topic of partnerships. I think we're going to need to see a greater and more robust, effective partnership between the public and private sector. It can't simply be, to John's opening comment, that the private sector complains, gee, government isn't doing enough to protect me, and the government, on the other hand, says, well, that's your problem, you go figure it out. So clearly that's not the solution. No one wants that, obviously. But one of the reasons we just established or have announced the establishment starting in next month of a new cyber security directorate within NSA is we want to have one focal point for our agency to be able to engage with other elements of the federal government and, as appropriate, the private sector. We have a limited responsibility for the private sector, particularly in terms of national security systems and dealing with the defense industrial base, but we don't generally have a duty at NSA to be responsible for the private sector's cybersecurity. That's to the extent that it's anyone's, it's the FBI on the law enforcement side and the Department of Homeland Security, as you know. But dealing with, I think, moving towards the areas of partnership is going to be much more significant. I think government has a responsibility to do more than just simply share indicators of compromise 6 months after the event. That's no help to the private sector. We need to be more robust and more active in providing information and tools to the private sector. I'm talking about government as a whole, not just NSA. And then on the other hand, the private sector also needs to recognize that as its attack surface, we all alluded to the vast mountains of data that are going to be created, the Internet of Things, et cetera. It is the private sector's responsibility to step up and make the investments in talent and money to address this and to work collaboratively. So it's not going to be solved either by the government on one hand or the private sector on the other, but by a joint approach.
I'm going to switch to some questions from the audience that I think builds right off where the discussion has landed. So Adam talked a little bit about and extended the hand and said it's been open since 2015 for companies who see their data being exfiltrated to call, and they'll seek to seize the data. A question from the audience is about U.S. Cyber Command. How could U.S. Cyber Command fill the gaps where companies might want to hack back? Could private companies give information directly to Cyber Commands for them to take offensive action, and is there currently any such program?
It is the responsibility of U.S. Cyber Command to protect and defend the nation in the cybersecurity, in the cyber realm. So that is the entity that's charged with that within the Department of Defense. And yes, while I'm not a representative of Cybercom, I work closely with them, and they certainly are in a position to receive information from the private sector to assist them, just the same way, as Adam has alluded to, the FBI is open to receiving tips from the private sector. Any information it gets, it can pursue law enforcement channels. Same thing with U.S. Cybercom, to the extent it receives information about intrusions or other cyber attacks against the United States. It certainly needs that information, and it then is in a position to take action as appropriate.
Any other thoughts on where a company sees? Let me give a fact scenario that companies are facing. So company is, they're under attack. It's a password spraying attack. This is an adversary where you see rapidly changing internet protocol addresses from overseas using the same username and password and trying essentially 50,000 accounts across a company and then recycling. It's very common right now with both Iranian-linked actors, North Korean-linked actors, and others. The company sees it, they're monitoring it, and they start trying to defend themselves, but they're not doing anything to stop the attack from occurring overseas. If they go to the FBI with the information, they look more to gather evidence, but they'll say we don't have the authority to disrupt it overseas unless we built a criminal case or otherwise. So Rich, Wyatt, or maybe we'll start with you, Rich. What is a company to do? Is that something where Cybercom could take action? Is there something they could do on the civil side of the house?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things you could do. I mean, first of all, we see this. We see this quite often. Password sprays. It's attacking you. Luckily, it's not a plug from Microsoft. We handle these things pretty well. But our team will get involved and says, okay, where is it coming from? Where are the IP addresses? The first thing you do on the private sector is where they're hailing from. Where are the hosting providers? Many times you'll notice that these IPs come back to a hosting provider that is a legitimate hosting provider either in Europe or in South America. And at that point, you tend to know if it's a legitimate company who runs those hosting providers. And guess what? You pick up the phone, you call them, and you talk to them and say, look, we believe you got a couple of accounts that are being used maliciously and currently scanning our network and trying to do some password sprays. And almost always, with some rare exceptions, we will get someone on the other line that says, really? Okay, well, let me see what we could do. And they would move to stop or kick that particular customer off their networks. So there are things that a private company could do very quickly to stop the harm immediately. Now, that, of course, does have some implications in terms of that you may lose some evidence behind who's doing that. But from a private sector perspective, we have to do an analysis as to, how long do you wait until you do something in order to collect evidence, or do you refer it and wait while the attack is ongoing? So the short answer is, from the private side, if you're being attacked this way, there are things that we do. Most of it is relationship-based. Under some rare situations, and if it's in a jurisdiction that needs some sort of legal process, you could go to law enforcement in that jurisdiction, or as a last alternative, if you have to file something civilly, you could do that as well.
I think the law enforcement model for addressing that looks very similar. It is amazing to me how much we get from the FBI's relationships with law enforcement counterparts around the world and how quickly they can move. And that gets us more, I think, than hacking back would much of the time. In this scenario you've posited, reaching out to the central authority and to law enforcement through law enforcement channels in that case, so that the provider can be contacted and kick a malicious actor off their service would be great. The problem your scenario points to, though, I think, is the number of safe havens that exist for that activity. In fact, that the provider that creates the service of the rapidly changing IP, essentially because they're catering to a market of actors that want to use that to obfuscate their behavior. And I think we need to have a conversation about privacy and security that is not in two different channels, because one response to that kind of that technique would be, maybe we want providers, in certain countries to keep certain records so that that cycling is something that is harder to do or is not a complete defeat of security measures or law enforcement. And so we should have that. We should talk about the costs and the benefits of that, the costs for privacy, but the benefits for security. So that's a different panel, probably.
So one question.
If I just could add one quick thing, it's a good point, Adam, and I agree that, what I discussed is very similar to what law enforcement does in terms of their relationships. But even with bulletproof hosters, and I think what you were describing are bulletproof hosters, and these are the shady hosters, which will basically, there's a concept in criminal law called deliberate ignorance, right, where you kind of look the other way and you're making money off what clearly is something that you should look into because it's illegal. But it's amazing what market pressure does, even to bulletproof hosters. And under the right situations, if you as a private company, or if you've identified several private companies are suffering from the same attack from a bulletproof hoster in a foreign jurisdiction, and everybody reaches out to that desk, their abuse desk, and put enough pressure on them, they will stop. Because sooner or later, there are third-party nonprofits out there that literally send updates to everybody around the world about which hosters are problematic. And by the way, this is their IP range. Mm-hmm. And then as a hosting provider, do you want your IP range completely blocked? Right. Because that's what happens. So the market pressures, again, looking from a private side perspective, actually helps us sometimes, even when it comes to bulletproof hosters, pushing them in that right direction.
I got a couple questions about legislation. And I'm not sure if there is an official government position or not, but for the full panel, what's your opinion of the Bipartisan Active Cyber Defense Certainty Act? And then linked to that, and if you need to make it more general, there were a couple questions about, do you think more safe harbor provisions are necessary to catalyze industries' increased sharing of information, even if it's done through some other mechanism than that act?
Okay. I don't think we have taken a position on that act yet, and apologies if I'm mistaken. Generally, what we've said about legislative fixes is we've asked questions about who's going to be affected by this, right? So is there the likelihood that an innocent owner of infrastructure is then going to be subjected to the act of cyber defense? What are the constraints on its use and the like? And we raised something that you've alluded to, John and Glenn, which is you take action, you're a private party, you disrupt, but the adversary happens to be a state actor and thinks, A, you're associated with the government or not, and decides to retaliate. Is this the world we want to open up? So I don't know that we've taken a position on it, but it raises all the questions we've been discussing about whether this action is a good idea. And I think really what we should be having a conversation about is what is it that people want to do, and does the law actually prohibit it? So Wyatt, you mentioned beacons, and I think people have different ideas of what that means. That could be dropping an implant to search a computer and send back information. Or, and I credit Stuart Baker for this idea, what if your Word documents all had a certain watermark that couldn't load unless it could make contact with a designated IP address. And if it did that, if the watermark couldn't load, the content wouldn't be perceptible. I don't know that I think of that as a beacon in the common sense, but I think it presents a different question. Maybe you get to the same answer, maybe you don't, but that's what lawyers like John are paid to analyze. I think we just need to understand what is it that people want to do, because most of the lists of techniques people want to exercise can be done, are within their network, or could be accomplished with some partnership with law enforcement. And then I think you asked a question about encouraging information sharing. And again, there, I'm not sure exactly what the concrete disincentive is, so if people can identify that, then we can talk about it.
I agree with what Adam said, and would underscore your comment about the need for more dialogue and more discussion. And John, if I could just make a sort of personal comment, not an agency comment, but from my perspective, having been a private sector lawyer who came to government just 4 years ago, it's been interesting to me to see the gap between where our legal regime stands across a large number of these issues and the current pace of technology, which has far outstripped our ability to create laws for it. So whether it's in the area of figuring out, again, this is a personal comment, how cyber authority is dispersed along a government. I don't think if anyone were starting with a blank sheet of paper today, you'd come up with a system we have where authority for cyber matters is scattered among numerous committees in Congress, across the federal agency and numerous agencies and departments, for good reasons and good historic reasons. I'm not being critical of it, but I'm just saying it's not necessarily the system you would come up with initially. And then, most significantly, we find that adversaries are able to take advantage of gaps in our law or features of our law, depending upon your point of view. What do I mean by that? Well, obviously, Russians figured out in the 2016 election how to take advantage of our freedoms, our First Amendment freedoms and other freedoms here, to spread disinformation in social networks. That's an advantage of our system, that we have that ability thanks to the First Amendment, but it also reveals a vulnerability. So our law and social norms haven't yet figured out how to address this complicated range of problems. No surprise, technology's advancing at a quick pace. Again, just a personal comment, but I do feel there's a gap between where our laws are and where technology is taking us.
If I could comment on the specific Active Cyber Defense Certainty Act, I think there are a couple problems here that would cause me to hesitate to say that this is something that should be done immediately. The first problem, as sort of Adam was talking about, there's kind of a lack of data, lack of clear use cases to know what exactly we want to be on the table for the private sector. The second problem is that there's international consequences, even when we're talking about something like a beacon. So even a beacon that accesses another computer in another country could violate domestic laws in that country. And so I think to get past this problem, I think we do need this kind of a flexible approach, short of amending the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, in parallel tracks. One of those tracks being the Department of Justice can start to create space to bring a little clarity, and it doesn't have to say exactly what techniques look like. It doesn't have to define exactly what the kind of watermark, the sort of digital watermark idea, looks like. It can simply set the guardrails and say, here are the parameters you have to remain within, and if you're able to do that and find a way to pull this off, we're not going to prosecute for you. The second track is to have an international dialogue, and it's not necessarily going to be with our adversaries, but at least among like-minded states, because there are other states, within Europe and the West more broadly, that are considering these things, that have sort of disharmony in their laws. And so I think we do need to have a conversation at the same time if we're making steps to create space for something like a beacon or something along the spectrum. Have a conversation with the British, with the French, on what would happen, how would we respond if that were to impact a computer in your jurisdiction, so that we're not going to be demanding extradition of each other's citizens for something that we agree should be innocuous and worth exploring. And I think that there are ways that you can do this and build those guardrails. And so one I mentioned earlier was civil liability and third-party liability coverage. And this is how we govern private security contractors in the physical world. So, for instance, in the maritime industry, the shipping industry widely uses a standard contract called GuardCon, and that contract has a threshold for third-party liability coverage. And that's the way that they weed out unqualified defenders, unqualified security guards. There are different ways that you can use things like insurance, market pressures, in addition to government tools, to kind of carve out that space that would allow for a little bit of experimentation while maintaining a grip on things so that we can figure out what works and if there is something like a watermark that we can make work.
I'm not familiar with the pending legislation or so I don't know how much I could talk about it, but I do want to make one quick point in terms of the sharing of information, right? And it depends on your definition of what information you're sharing. And there's a difference between looking at malware code and the sharing of things that are not considered someone's communications. And currently the law is very clear on that. You could share that, and we share it quite freely. Malware code, and once you have the code, if you look at it from that perspective, you're able to then basically reverse engineer it and move back and pretty much identify what you need to identify to protect yourself. So from that perspective, I think the private sector has been doing a very good job in sharing malware code and hashes so that we can defend ourselves much more efficiently and provide that to both our private sector partners as well as government partners.
So switching gears, there's been a bunch of questions. Adam, you attracted some attention with your 6-month remark that it takes roughly 6 months usually for a company to detect whether or not they've been hacked. So a couple questions following up on that. Does that apply to enterprise cloud environments? Will there be faster reporting times when it comes to enterprise cloud? What responsibilities should those who provide the cloud have to their customers to notify them when they're seeing bad acts? And then to broaden out, if after that 6 months you do refer to the FBI or to Cybercom, how long before it's going to take that, how much additional time is it going to take for them to act? How much time are you ending to the tail? And then finally, do you have an example of an actual case that you could walk us through without divulging too much when a company refers? And that one I know you can answer, that there have been some. But let me widen those out, because some of those are for Adam, but really some of those are applicable to the group. I'll start with you, Adam.
I'll start with as many as I can remember. The 6-month figure, I think, comes from the Verizon data breach report, investigations report from 2018. And I think that figure has gotten better over time, but that's the last figure I remember seeing. Sitting here today, cannot think of an instance where someone has come to us and said, there is where the stolen data is, can you get it or stop it? But if that happened, and we are talking about discovering the breach within very short order, and it were here in the United States, I think we would move very swiftly to get a warrant, which we're used to doing in any number of circumstances. Cloud providers. The hope, I think, is that managed services or centralization creates a higher average level of security than particularly small and medium enterprises are able to provide for themselves. And so I hope that's the case, and that, yes, that would lead to discovery. We are seeing a tension, I would say. There is pressure on the providers because they themselves may not have perfect understanding of what happened on their network. And so they may not always know exactly what to tell their clients about what was affected. And so that is creating an interesting situation where you have what I'll call the endpoint victims, or the ultimate victims, their provider, and law enforcement. And my view is when we investigate an intrusion, there may be one victim alone, right? There may be a corporate victim and it's IP, or it might be a situation where there's a breach here, but there are a lot of third-party victims. And we have a responsibility to use those ultimate, what I'll call third-party victims as well. So we've got to balance working with the provider, but also ensuring that those third-party victim rights are respected, which I think is tricky.
I think Adam's right. I think you're right, Adam, in terms of when we talk about cloud providers. It's very complicated because there's so many different ways you could use the cloud. In terms of managed services, we would hope that small and medium businesses will, in fact, be in a much better place in terms of being able to identify and report, depending on the cloud provider they go to and what services they contract the cloud provider before. And what I'm getting at is that there are so many different, levels of service, ranging from security, is it just a container? But if they, in fact, check all the boxes and they do want, all of these security features or that come with a particular cloud provider, that should address the issue, especially for small and medium businesses, and making them able to pick these things up much quicker. But you also have to understand that many times, cloud service providers are simply the container. And the company that signs up for the service will do all of their own. They'll manage everything, all their security, even though it may be hosted in someone else's cloud. So that really depends on the company and what their practices are and whether or not they'll be able to pick something up quicker than normal.
And worth flagging, you reminded me of this. We've seen a number of data leaks in the recent year or two where people were using the cloud, were responsible, I think, for its configuration and misconfigured how it was stored, or whether it was misconfiguration or what have you, it seems like data was exposed and not in an intentional way. So merely storing something offsite is not a guarantee that it's more secure.
Yeah, it's you're storing offsite, and again, when you go to a cloud provider, irrespective of the company, you have to understand what you're signing up for and what are the services that they offer, both from a security side and how much of the responsibility you have for your own data. And again, these contracts vary in scope and in size, and it behooves the company to really try to understand better, well, what am I purchasing? What is being offered to address issues just like that, Adam? Just as sometimes, you may have some very unsophisticated, smaller businesses assuming certain things. Well, I'll go to the cloud and everything's taken care of, and that's not necessarily true. There are other options and other, price points that go with that service. So it's very important to understand what you're doing before you move to the cloud. It can be fantastic if it's done correctly.
And let me, we've talked, and Adam, your use example is often focused around data theft and recovery. But a couple of questions have asked about a different scenario, which is when you're having an active defense of a system where the goal of the attacker is disruption. And I think that is the gist of the cyber command question as well. So do you see a gap right now in terms of what a private company can do, and also whether there's a gap in the government's ability to respond quickly, and whether or not it's even the government's role, because I know it's something we wrestled with attacks like the North Korean attack on Sony Motion Pictures. Is it the government's role to help protect a movie distributor when they're under real-time attack, or is that something we want to incentivize them to have? This is the moral hazard trap that Wyatt raised earlier. If the government's going to step in there, then it doesn't really incentivize companies to protect themselves, and those aren't necessarily core to our national defense.
I'll answer the second question first. Law enforcement's job is to prevent crime if it can, consistent with the law, to mitigate the impacts of crime to the extent we can, and to prosecute those responsible. And I put them in that order. So yes, it is the government's responsibility to do what we can consistent with the context we're in, which is one where we don't see a lot of what happens on the internet, right? The internet is essentially in private hands, or visibility is constrained. Well, I'll let Glenn speak for his own visibility, but I tend to think that it's constrained. So yes, it's our job, and as to the active sort of defense, under attack at that moment, I guess I need to know, I can't answer your question about a gap. My sense is that you can do a lot by controlling your firewall and within the boundary of your network. And you can do even more by, Rich suggests, relying on providers that rank the reputation of different parts of the internet. There are some seedy neighborhoods in the internet, and you can control whether they can get past your firewall to some extent. But if there is an example of someone wanting to do something in that urgent situation that they think the law prohibits that would also be effective, that's the unicorn I'm looking for, and I haven't heard it quite yet.
Glenn, what do you see limits on authorities in this space? You certainly witness ongoing attacks against companies in your intelligence mission, but then what happens when they're a private company inside the United States being attacked by somebody overseas? Who takes action to stop the attack? Not just notify, but stop the attack.
Yeah, so it's, as you've alluded to, a complex question. I'm not going to refer to any particular incident, but our director, General Nakasone, has gone on record a number of times saying that he has the adequate legal authority that he needs to fulfill his missions, both as as commander of U.S. Cybercom as well as NSA. So I don't really think at the moment we're facing a legal gap in this area, although, as I alluded to, I think broadly there are legal questions that need to be examined as technology continues to move forward. But right now, I think we have the adequate legal tools. I think we're facing other problems, just mechanical problems, attribution problems, et cetera. And then there is this question that you alluded to, which doesn't have, I think, a definitive answer, which is what exactly is the government's responsibility when an individual business is attacked apparently by a nation state? And I think that's just an open question. Clearly, broadly speaking, the government has a duty to defend the nation, and exactly what activity rises to something where the private sector is affected that warrants a official reaction by the government is a gray area. There are all sorts of ways to respond to it, as you know, John. Everything, and Adam has referred to both. There's individual prosecutions where the government has gone after bad actors and prosecuted them. There are situations in which we've determined that a nation state was responsible and we've imposed sanctions, financial sanctions, et cetera. And in other situations, we have taken action in a cyber domain, and not every cyber action, as often been said, requires a cyber response. So it's an area that I think is somewhat gray in some respects, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. So there's some ambiguity that I think works in our favor.
What?
I think there's an interesting example, and it does depend on, if you're talking about a nation state, it is a different situation, and it seems like with the shift in, DoD's cyber strategy, they're more actively seeking to, persistently engage with those kinds of threats, including to the private sector, not just to government. I do think there's a valid question about this kind of, unicorn, like what technique would help you in this situation, but I think if we were to identify a prospective technique, and there may be some candidates out there, I think there is a way that you could do this, and the logic of self-help is not that, this should be the first resort, but the logic of self-help is to allow individuated decisions by corporations of how to respond in a situation. And so you build into that principles of necessity and proportionality. If you're not doing the basic cyber hygiene stuff, then you shouldn't be considering doing a technique that carries some sort of risk of third-party liability. And if you are doing the basic cyber hygiene stuff, then it'll take care of 90% or so of cyber attacks, and you're already taking that off the table. And so you're locating that space where there may be a technique that actually assists in this scenario, and you can sort of carve out the parameters around that. And at the same time, that allows for corporations to make the call, and they have to weigh those factors, including escalation as a concern. And it may be that the response they're contemplating might actually just cause them to be hit back harder by the APT or whatever it is that's targeting them. But we have in the physical world allowed a certain degree of leeway and created the conditions in which you can allow for those sorts of individuated judgments of how to respond in those situations, if we can identify some of those candidate techniques that would actually help in the situation in the first place, which is an open question.
Yeah. Well, reaching the end of our time, we've clearly solved the problem today. So thanks for that. If you could join me in thanking our panelists.